Awesome. Okay. Well, welcome everybody to the Lightup virtual conference supporting UNICEF. We are here learning 24 hours of Microsoft technologies and learning. This is all to help fundraising for COVID-19. Most of us are, our lives have been changed in some way by COVID-19, and we're all trying to do what we can to help. So this is a great event. Feel free to tell your friends about this event and, just try to help us kind of figure out where we're headed in terms of getting this this COVID-19 issue hopefully headed in the right direction. So feel free to use the hashtag Lightup. And this event is powered by the C# Corner and the Tech Platform. So thanks to them as well for getting this event together. You are here hopefully to hear a presentation about how to streamline your database deployments. My name is Elizabeth Noble. I am a director of database development for a retail company. And if you want to find me, I am on Twitter at SQL Zelda. So we've got a barcode here. You can go ahead and scan that QR code. And, once again, just give your support for UNICEF and for trying to make some progress with COVID-19. Also want to thank our sponsors. We've got several great sponsors here. So feel free, check them out, reach out to their resources. This event wouldn't be possible without all of their help. So we are very grateful for them. We've also got some feedback QR codes. We've got a speaker feedback QR code as well as an event feedback QR code. In addition, I will be speaking for the first 45 minutes or so. We do have a chat channel open for attendees to ask questions. So feel free to put your questions in there, and about 15 till the hour, we'll go ahead and get those questions answered. So feel free to send your questions, all that good stuff. So we're here to talk about database deployments, one of my great passions. And kind of how I came into the world of database deployments was, first of all, I played, MMOs, and I saw the deployment release notes and thought it was super cool and exciting. And then I got into IT. I was started as a database administrator, thought it was awesome. And then I did my first deployment, and that was pretty cool. Like, I was excited about deployments, but throughout time, what I found was my deployments were getting trickier and trickier. And so I had several deployments where, I would be up all night working on a deployment, or there would be 40 different manual scripts that I had to run. I might have grabbed the wrong script, or somebody may have uploaded the wrong script. And so when we came in the next morning, we found out the wrong code was deployed. Or sometimes at a previous company, I had experiences where, you'd push a bug fix out. The next thing you knew, the bug fix was rolled back because that change had gotten overwritten. And so this desire for database deployments came from a passion of basically how do we get out of this role, right? Because nobody wants to wake up after being up all night, having to triage what's happening, having a war room. It's like I got in the habit after deployments. I'd wake up after a deployment. I'd immediately look at my phone and check to make sure that I didn't have 16 messages, even before I got out of bed. Things like rollbacks and bug fixes. None of that's fun. Nobody likes the stress of having a deployment go sideways. And whatever we can do to improve that deployment process, I'm all about, because I really want to get rid of the stress in my life and the life of those around me. I want to not worry about letting people down, because that is a huge deal for me. I tend to worry quite a bit about whether I'm performing to my own expectations and the expectations of those around me. And of course, IT is prone to burnout. So I also didn't want to end up in a situation where I was burning out or I was burning other people out. And to give a little bit of an example, so I started about a couple years ago. We deployed a new piece of software, and we decided to do a phased rollout. And part of that phased rollout was we deployed one store, and then the next week you deployed 2 more stores. What we ended up finding is we ended up finding bugs and code changes and feature changes. and I was manually managing all of this code, and it was a nightmare. I mean, I was doing 3 deployments a week, 3 to 4 hours a night, at least probably 6 hours a night, to be honest. It was a lot of work, and I kind of got to the point that I was just like, there has to be a better way. And so I really took that opportunity of having lots of deployments and late nights and having to figure out which code to deploy manually and having to come in the next day and fix things, to want to start moving forward to something where the deployments were easier, that they weren't hard, they just worked, and I didn't have to spend a lot of time thinking about it because, as I said, we're a retail company where I'm at, so most of our deployments happen 9:30 p.m., which isn't super late, but it's late enough that if things go sideways, you're up until the middle of the night trying to make sure that, you know, the retail store is open the next morning. So definitely something I didn't want to deal with. So to kind of take a closer look into where I started my process, I had everything was manual, right? So for me, everything was Jira user stories and script files, and they were uploaded on a release page. I found out that the other data team, the people on my team, were scared of automation. They were scared that, you know, I mean, the database is important. The database has all the data. I mean, for my company, it has all the data in it that is used to run our retail stores, to keep track of our sales. And so automating deploying a database can be very difficult or fear-inducing, because if one script goes out wrong, everything can go sideways, you know. So you want to make sure, or you want to have those guardrails to make sure that when things happen, you're not just overwriting everything that's out there. And in a lot of ways, there was a little bit of a fear of losing control. So we had a lot of conversations when we started about how to handle some of this. How do we design our deployment process so that we know what's happening, so we feel comfortable with what's happening, and so we can get rid of those manual steps. And that kind of led us to come up with some standards for things. So part of what we focused on is, how do we want to deploy a database? You know, so one of the benefits I touted in terms of moving towards database deployments is, for instance, having databases and source control. And one of the benefits of having a database and source control is that you can, when you do a code review, you don't have to guess what code changed. Source control really helps you figure out what code changed. And so that kind of helped some of that overall consistency with managing the database code. And then deploying things automatically. You know, where I was at, one of the challenges I had when we did all these deployments and I was up late at night is my development team, their application was in a CI/CD pipeline, continuous integration, continuous delivery pipeline. And so they had bundled packages and they knew exactly what package to deploy. And on deployment night, they hit one button and it went everywhere, you know, or they hit 2 buttons because they had a beta version and a regular version, but they only had to do like 2 things, whereas I was doing like 40 of them. So I wanted to get to that automatic way of handling things. Not to mention, having the database in source control provided some more checks and things. So like when we first put the database in source control, we found out that having it in source control, if we tried to build it, we found, you know, stored procedures that reference columns that didn't exist anymore. You know, so we had to go fix those. We had to go get that resolved, but it actually kind of helped make us more comfortable with what was in our database. So one of the issues that can happen, you know, manually and honestly, when you start setting up a pipeline, some of the issues to try to work through are what's happening with the code. And so later on in this session, we'll talk about branching and merging strategies and how those will help you try to figure out, or how to make sure that you're not overwriting previous changes that you've already deployed, or that you can control exactly what is being deployed. Similar to code changes, one of the things that you have to work out when you start trying to streamline your database deployments is defining an overall process. And that's not only a process of how do you check in the code, but also, you know, what is your deployment method? Which is one other thing we'll talk about as part of this session is your deployment method options later on, which will help you understand what's happening at the end. At the same time, there's other things in process that you kind of need to think and have conversations about in terms of your development teams. You know, when we first designed our deployment process, my company had everybody together in one unified team. Now we had little, you know, sub departments in that team, but we all worked together. We all had the same sprint cycle. We all released everything on the same sprint. And so that made the conversation very different than where we are now, where we have 2 development teams, 1 database team, and the database team and one of the development teams are on the same sprint cycle, but everybody's using the same databases. So we've got a long-term development team that has a completely different, you know, release cadence than the rest of us. And so we had to figure out, how do we manage deploying database code when we have multiple different teams with multiple different ways they're deploying things? And this kind of really led to where this presentation came from, is that when I originally designed our release process with the development team and QA, we had one process and it worked great. And basically everybody checked everything in, and then the DBAs reviewed it. And then if the DBAs approved it, they merged it into the main branch, and then they deployed from the main branch. It was very simple. Well, what ended up happening was, first of all, that got a little confusing. So we ended up just deploying from basically the development branch. And then to make matters more confusing, as we kind of changed our sprint cadence, we started deploying everything, except we didn't want to deploy everything. So then we were creating manual scripts to roll back changes that we didn't want to deploy. And at the time, the perspective kind of started being, maybe we shouldn't be doing automated database deployments. Maybe this is too messy. Maybe this is too new. And my take on it really was that the way we managed our teams, our organizational structure had changed. And so one of the things that we wanted to handle as part of that is to redesign what our process was for deploying things. Now, one of the things I hear in almost every presentation having to deal with deploying database changes is handling data modifications, ad hoc queries. They're kind of, in any way, shape, or form, they generally tend to be one of those things that we're all kind of hush hush about and don't want to talk about, but they're there and they happen. And so there are some ways to handle manual data modifications, and we'll go over kind of some of the pros and cons, or at least depending on what deployment method you choose, will kind of determine which one is easier to handle those manual data modifications. So the whole goal of this is to kind of get out of this world where we feel like we don't know what's happening. You know, you do a deployment, you come in the next day and you're like, oh my goodness, like everything's broken and I don't know why. Or to me, it feels like there's gremlins in your system. Like you just start not trusting anything. And my goal ultimately is to get out of that world, get out of the manual world, get out of the world where I don't trust what's happening, and design an environment where I'm comfortable and I'm happy with how things are happening. And I feel confident that when I deploy things at night, I know what they're going to look like in the morning. So that kind of brings us to, why are we doing it this way? And one of the reasons is that in my world, usually when the problem solving happens, you want to get to the root cause, but a lot of times you don't have time to figure it out. And so my overall strategy is, how do we make this all more proactive? How do we improve the overall kind of structure? So we're going to walk through we're going to go kind of in a reverse order from what you would expect. And that's partly, to me, because how you're going to deploy the code is going to determine some other things about what tools you're going to use. And it doesn't really control your branching and merging strategy, but it's kind of better to have the end in mind before you start at the beginning. So we've got two really different ways of managing the code. And for me, the easiest way to think about what these two methods are is you have your source code and you have your database. And so your code goes from your source code to your database. You can essentially control exactly what code is getting deployed, or you can control exactly what your database will look like at the end. You can't control both, though. So you can't pick exactly what you're going to deploy and necessarily know you're going to end up with exactly what you're expecting. And that's partly because, I'm sure as some of you are aware, there are things like hot fixes that happen. Something, a report might be running that's slow and it's causing everything else to fail, and somebody goes into the system and creates an index. Well, if they create the index on the database and don't put it into source control, that can cause issues. And we'll walk through some demos of what that looks like. So this method where you control everything that you're deploying is called the migration-based method. And this is where you're controlling exactly what you're deploying. So you basically save individual script files of what you're deploying. And I've got a tool set up in Visual Studio that we can look at the code in a second, but I kind of wanted to walk through what this looks like from a database perspective. So you've got your migration-based and you're controlling what you're deploying. So this side over here with the green is your source code. This first database is basically like your development database. This is some like outside of source control. The second one that's kind of gray or black is your code that would be your hot fix that you might not have put into source, or you did not put into source control, and it would be deployed to production. So what you can do is when you deploy your source code to your development environment, it essentially you take that one file, and that one file then goes into the database. That's exactly how it is. If I then, so I'm in development, I've got my script there. If I go and I manually fix something and I put that in production, my databases are in two different states now. So they're not consistent. So there's something different, say a new index on the database on the right that isn't in the database on the left. And it's okay that the code that's in the development database isn't in production because we haven't deployed to production yet, but there's still a difference in terms of that index that is going to get missed. And so if I then try to deploy to production, what's going to happen is, let me try that demo again. It goes into production. And then you see how we have the two databases are slightly different. So it's got the new development code, but it doesn't actually, it still has the new index as well. And so if you took the database schema from development and compared it to production, they would not match. And that's where I say that when you're working on a migration-based deployment, you can control what you're deploying, but you can't necessarily control exactly what your database is going to look like at the end. Now, this is a simple enough example that we can all understand, hey, I put an index out there and I know the index is out there and I know that index is going to be different. But there are times where what can happen is you have lots of different changes, right? Or maybe somebody has elevated permissions and they just kind of get in the habit of changing things. And so one of the gotchas to this is, particularly from my perspective, and I've worked at places where, like, for instance, everybody had SA, right? So if everybody has the SA login, people can go and change things in production and may not necessarily communicate it. And it's not really that people are necessarily ill-intentioned. It just, as I said, we get busy, right? So you're trying to fix something, you forget to put it back in source control and things end up out of sync, and that can create issues over time. So, but that is one of the methods to think about. If you have really tight security, I think this is perfectly, like, it's great, right? Because you don't have to worry about anybody getting into your production database and changing things. I, however, did not have that same luxury when I was setting up my first couple systems. And we will try, I'm going to try to change screens. So to give you an idea of what migration-based database project would look like in source control, we've got this solution on the right-hand side, and I'm using a free tool called DBUp for my migration-based source control. And you can see I've got a script over here called create vendors. You essentially need to create the scripts in a like sort of numerical file name order so that you can control the order that they're deploying in. And so for this particular script, I have this table DBO vendor, and that's in my source control. If I go to my database and I open Object Explorer, you can see, let's see here, I've got these I've got the table vendor in there. But what I can do is I can go and copy this table creation statement. And I'm going to make a new item. And the one funky thing that the way I've gotten it to work is I can go ahead and create it, but I've got to use a text file to do it. This was vendor payment. If not, I can change the name. But I'm going to go ahead and create a new file. Vendor payment, perfect. And I can go ahead and save that change. Now, if I go back to my database, one of the things that happens with, you see this table schema versions. If I query this table schema versions, right now it tells me that it has already run the script create vendor table. So part of what DBUp does is it keeps this log of activities that have happened. Now, I've added the second file to my source control, but I haven't actually run it. So what I would need to do is I can hit F5 to run that. It's going to pop up this little console window. And if all works well, I will have a new table. Fingers crossed. Nope, I did not. Well, that's what's supposed to happen. Let me just check my package, my program configuration. It is correct. All right, so here's what we're going to do, just so we can see the magic happen. We're going to try to trick it. Okay. And then 5. Seem to get a bit more text there, so we'll see if it woke up. All right, so we've got the vendor table. So there might be like a syntax error. Let's see what's, I don't want to get too far into debugging code. So we're not going to worry about why that didn't show up. But I did successfully get the vendor table to show up. I'm going to guess what's actually happening is, since I haven't checked this change in, that may be why it hasn't picked it up yet. But we won't worry about that for the moment. Okay, so that's what a migration base looks like, is you have script by script, each individual item. You can do table creation statements. I said earlier we'd get into those ad hoc queries. Migration based, in my opinion, is really kind of the better tool for handling data update, data manipulation sorts of activities. So definitely something to look at. The other option is state-based. So that's where everything in source control is going to get deployed. So once again, I've got my code, I've got my development database, I'm deploying it. it goes to development. I can do the same thing when I deploy my changes. Essentially, depending on all my toggles, production will look like development after I've finished deploying to production. And then we'll walk through an example, just like we did with the migration-based, of what happens when there is a hotfix that's applied. So we'll start again. We have some code. The code goes to development. The code that's in source control goes to development. We have a production issue. We deploy a hotfix. We don't put that information in source control. And then we're ready for our production deployment. Well, when we do our production deployment, we overwrite whatever the hotfix was. That's actually what my company, my team, the development team, that's what we all decided we wanted. We wanted the assurance that source control was our source of truth. So we chose a state-based, but I know lots of individuals who prefer a migration-based. They prefer that kind of granular control over exactly what's being deployed. Oh, and let's go do a demo of what that looks like. All right, so this is what a state-based type of database might look like. I'm gonna roll this one up because that's for a different kind of conversation. What happens is you can actually, if you already have a database in production, one of the nice things is you can right click and you can actually import the database into source control. It will import it automatically. So once again, I'm using SQL Server technology, Visual Studio. So under the covers, this is using SQL Server data tools, and it is free with Visual Studio. So it's another free tool you can use to manage your SQL Server source control. DBup, for instance, is usable with Postgres and MySQL. So it is more versatile in terms of the various databases out there besides SQL Server products. But we've got a vendor table also. And it's got some cool little functionality that if you don't want to write the SQL, you don't have to. Similarly, I could add a new item. This is a little, oh, you know what? I know, I'll go show that in a minute. This is a little easier to kind of get that warm, fuzzy feeling where I can go look at tables and I can say that I'm going to make a table and I can call it vendor payment. And then I've got vendor payment. And that should do it. So you can see it had a little bit of error handling to kind of tell me everything was fine. I can go ahead and build this solution. And check it in. I know that I'm using the main branch. I haven't renamed yet. We'll get into branching and merging in a jiffy. So I'm going to go ahead and sync this. I actually have a continuous integration, continuous delivery pipeline set up for this database. So right now, if I go look at the database, it should not have that table, but in a few minutes, it should. So right now, it just has bill.vendor. I forgot to rename the schema, so we'll bump into that in a second. Okay, so that is state-based. See if it's going to take like a few minutes for the state-based to update. And I guess to give you a sneak peek. So I don't really get into building the pipelines as part of this presentation because my real goal is to make sure that you know how to set up your state-based, migration-based, your branching and merging strategies in order to get these pipelines set up. Once you kind of have the pipelines set up, they're really not, they're kind of reusable. So once you get one database set up, you can reuse it for each of them. Let's see here. So if I go back to the previous, see here, it takes about 2 minutes. So we're at about, we've got about another minute to go, maybe until it finishes. So while that's running, I remembered what I did, what I needed to do on that DB up to get that script to deploy. So we're gonna jump back to that real quick while this is running. Because the DB up, I like it. I will say I come from an operations, like not IT operations, but business operations and database background. So I do not come from the development background. So some of this is a little different for me. But one of the things that you need to do on these SQL files in DB up is you need to go in and you need to change the build action property to embedded resource. And then once you do that, now it should go ahead and deploy that table. So we're going to go check on, yep. So the build succeeded for my state-based. And right now, excuse me, right now it's working on deploying, I believe. Yeah, deploying all of that. But if I go back to the forecast migration, which is kind of the first one we were looking at, that we remember I added the script and then it wouldn't deploy. So I'm just going to refresh this. And then if I go to tables, I should see it now, and I do. So there we go. That was a migration-based deployment. And you saw, so I did the one deployment, I got the vendor table migrated, and then I did another deployment and did the vendor payment, and there were not any issues. So that is okay because of this schema versions table. So that table I showed you earlier, if I go back, it might let me query it again. So now you can see that I do have those two entries. So it has recorded that both those items have been deployed. And I think from a deployment perspective, it actually is kind of nice so that you can keep track and know when everything's been deployed. Now we're going to go check on that automated deployment process. And it looks like it is still in progress. I actually have built some unit testing in. I'm trying to build out my overall pipeline. So got a few minutes here still. So it's working on deploying the database, and we're going to give it those just a minute or two, I think. Let's see how long the other deployments took. Couldn't really say. Okay, we'll check on that in a minute because we've got to keep on moving on. So branching and merging. So branching and merging are kind of the two strategies you use to kind of keep track of where your changes are and then how you're going to put them back into the overall perspective. So where I'm at, one of the ways that we use branching is essentially to give us a copy of the current code base and give us kind of an individual area to use that code base to do our development, so that I'm not changing one stored procedure and somebody else is changing a table and maybe our changes are conflicting with each other. It kind of gives us our own little workspace. So that's kind of one of the main benefits of branching. And then the strategy is, how do you get all that information back together? And that does get particularly tricky with SQL Server, just because there is this SQL project file that keeps track of each individual item. And at least in my experience, almost all of our merge conflicts have to do with that one particular file when people are adding lots of different things. So where I'm at, we actually have probably, I would say, potentially a pretty complex branching strategy. Once we've gotten used to it, it's pretty easy to follow. We do feature branches, release branches, hotfix branches, story branches, epic branches. So we've got potentially branches everywhere. but we kind of have decided that what we want is we want to have everything kind of partitioned off for each individual task. Once again, the strategy that we went with for setting this up was it's the same strategy that the development team is using for branching their application code. So it kind of helps keep that process for them similar. And that's kind of my overall strategy with continuous integration and continuous delivery and DevOps is I want the process to be consistent. So I don't want developers to have to remember the database is super special and I got to do all this super special stuff. I want it to be consistent. So having a lot of branching options sounds kind of complex, and I'll be honest, it is kind of, it can get complex, but once you kind of get in the swing of it, it's not too bad. So to give you an idea, here's a branch, right? So we've got our main branch. We're going to do a pull request. So that's basically going to, or not a pull request, I'm sorry. We're going to pull master down to our main branch down to make sure that we have the most up-to-date main branch. And then once we have the most up-to-date main branch on our machines when we're using GitHub, because that's the joy of GitHub, is going to go ahead and create a branch off of main. And in this case, it could be like a feature branch. So essentially, I'm starting with a copy of basically the same code that's in production. When I'm ready to deploy it, I've got my feature branch. For where we're at, our company decided we want to control exactly what's going into the release. We want to control exactly the code that's getting deployed. We want to know exactly what code that's getting deployed. And we kind of want to keep it separate from the main branch until we know we're happy with it. So what we do is we make sure we pull main down again. We create another branch for the release. That's where we start getting into our merging strategies. So that's where we will take that feature branch and merge it into the release branch so that when we're ready to deploy, it's all there. And one of the nice things is that then we can very clearly see and choose what's being deployed. So it kind of gives us that granularity of, you know, this user story is okay to deploy, this user story isn't, and it lets us pick and choose what we're deploying and then handle any potential merge conflicts prior to that, prior to releasing all the code. So for us, we deploy that release branch to our UAT environment. And then once it's deployed to the UAT environment, we will deploy it to production. After it's deployed to production, we will then merge the release branch back to the main branch. So that's kind of our overall flow, and that's kind of what we've done that makes us feel like we're mitigating risk and that we're kind of in control of the things that are happening. So just kind of walking through this again. If we've got one feature, right, and then we have another feature branch. So now we've got two feature branches. It would be the same sort of process where you've merged both of them in to your release branch, and then deploy to UAT, deploy to production, and merge back. And so this is kind of a high level look at what our overall branching release branching and merging strategy can look like. Now, I've had people attend my presentation. To give you an idea, as I said, I work at a retail company. All of our applications are internal. So we normally are not keeping track of like versions of applications. So this is not necessarily the solution you want to go with. I know people that, you know, like software vendors that are selling multiple versions of applications. This kind of branching and merging strategy won't work for them at all. And honestly, I think they look at me like we're a little silly for having this. But it really does depend on your business. So you don't want to just copy whatever's out there. You really want to have those conversations and come to a conclusion about what you want to do. So merge conflicts, which is absolutely something that can happen. As I said, with SQL projects, it's even more likely because you've got, if you have two people adding items at the same time, that kind of merge conflict will happen. You definitely want to discuss what your strategies are for handling a merge conflict. Another process that my company uses, which is not considered ideal, is that because we tend to keep those branches out, and like we could have like a database epic branch open for several months, is we can actually create merge conflicts, and we know that. So where we're at, we handle those merge conflicts in the pull request. Now, I know a lot of times the strategy is to handle the merge conflict before the pull request. So that's going to be another conversation that you want to have internally. And there are ways to do it. I will say, I think that if the concern is with merge conflicts, then adopting a strategy similar to ones I've heard before. So once again, some of the companies that develop their own software, they merge their code like every day or every 3 days, like no more than 3 days can they have their code checked out of like the main branch. And that's kind of how they manage it. So you definitely want to consider how your branching and merging is going to work and how that's going to interact with your potential for merge conflicts, and then how you want to manage those merge conflicts. So we've got a demo, and I know I've done a little bit of demo already. So
you have 5 minutes.
I know. I usually joke that I'm a 45-minute speaker, and today, yeah, this is good. It's okay. It's good.
Okay.
So I'm going to check out this forecast table. I'm going to see before I go look at the code if it made it there. And it did. And you see, I have a DBO vendor payment table, but not that bill vendor payment table, because I didn't name that correctly. So we're going to see if in 5 minutes we can do some branching and merging. So I'm in the main branch. I am going to, I tell you, I use this every day, and I still feel like I click around half the time more than I should. So we're gonna, make a branch for a new table, and I would normally not name it at these names, but I'm trying to kind of simulate that merge conflict quickly. And we're going to make a new branch called new stored procedure. So in this lower right-hand corner, you can see what branch you're working in. And so I'm just going to add a new stored procedure. And I even can click add new stored procedure. All right, let's just say, let's see if I can build this. All right, so build succeeded. I'm going to go ahead and commit and sync these changes and all that good stuff. And then I'm going to switch branches. And I'm going to make a new table. I don't know if I'm going to get this done in time, so we'll see. I've got like 1 minute, no big deal. We'll see how the questions are doing. Maybe. Table, yep, I'll go ahead and save it. Sync. All right, so those are both going on up to GitHub right now. course, I didn't have GitHub set up. Got all this stuff out here. Oh, you know what? It's an Azure DevOps. So I might just, here we go. Pull request. Yep. How are we doing?
We are at 4:45.
Okay.
And we do have a question.
Sure.
I don't know if you see it in your screen, but
I
maybe while
cannot.
that's running. We have a question that says, how much time would you estimate that you have saved by using these methods?
Oh my gosh. So we put all of our databases in source control. So we had just one for like 2 years. So starting in September of last year, we finally moved all the databases to source control. I would easily say we do deployments every 2 weeks. So I'd say at least 40 hours, probably more than that. To give you an idea, our deployments used to take 2 to 3 hours to deploy. And it was oftentimes because of all the different SQL scripts. So the more SQL scripts we had, to deploy this method, I literally click a button. I review the script to make sure I'm comfortable with what is being deployed. So I just cursory look at something to see what's being deployed. And then I hit a button and it goes. And so my database portion to deploy a database now takes 5 minutes a deployment. So it's pretty, for me, it's pretty phenomenal. I've kind of gotten used to the fact that our deployments take, maybe an hour, and that used to be scary. Like if we had an hour deployment, we were pretty scared, and now if we have an hour deployment, we're not uncomfortable. So it's pretty great. So if you guys want to stick around, if there aren't any other questions, I'm going to try to finish merging this, if that's okay. Pretty much want to let it finish processing though.
I think that's great.
Okay, cool. We'll see if I can get a merge conflict and if I can solve it in Azure DevOps. I kind of switched to Azure DevOps from GitHub. So a lot of times I start with what my company uses, and then as I'm trying to experiment and learn more ways of doing things, I'll branch out. So the other benefit that I didn't really get into with continuous integration and continuous delivery, if you haven't used those before, is you have artifacts. So you have like packages at the end that are built. And so it won't help you with the data. So if you're changing like a table, it won't help. But these automated tools, you have so I have access to the last version of the database code that I deployed. And so for instance, if I came in the next morning and found out that everything was broken and I couldn't figure out how to fix it fast enough, with just pretty much like a button click, you can roll it back to the previous version without having that concern about, I don't know what I deployed, or I don't have those scripts handy. Probably 40 hours for time saved on deployments is probably a mild estimate. I would say we probably save at least 5 to 10 hours of deployment, but probably 5 hours of deployment on people managing code. So we used to have people write stored procedures that had the if exists, then do this thing. Every single deployment had to have rollback scripts. So now we're kind of in that environment where the developers can just write a script and check it in, and that's really all that they need to worry about. So it takes a lot of time off of their hands. It does make it less stressful for my team that's deploying. And honestly, what I've found happens is it's kind of gotten so easy to do that now when we have to do something manual, because like for instance, I said that we haven't figured out how to do those manual script changes. Now that since we haven't done that, whenever we have to do a manual script change, it now feels like a big deal because we're not as accustomed to doing those changes. So yeah, I'm glad to feel like I have my life back. I can put it that way. I honestly think this might take a while, and I know that we're getting near time, so
yeah. So we have the next
call it quick.
presentation starting in 10 minutes. So maybe
Okay, sure.
We don't have the next presenter showing up yet, though. So that's why I'm saying
Okay.
we have time.
Okay. All right. Well, great. We'll see how long it takes. Maybe we'll go look at the log and see if it's telling us anything exciting. You would think for two little tables. So this merge request you're seeing, and kind of like when I was like, we're saving a lot of time on the deployment, you're not necessarily doing this particular step on the deployment. So it's really, this is all kind of planned and staged ahead of time. So it kind of takes some of that, that work off of there. Now I should get a merge conflict, and I did. And you see it's in the SQL project file. I'm going to see if it will let me. Yeah. See if I can figure out how to handle side by side. There we go. So there's my new table. And it's like, should give me the option. Let's see here. So what's happening, and I'm kind of, let's see here, security bill, vendor info. There's usually like in GitHub an option to like pick one versus the other. There we go. Let's see if I can figure it out real quick. It might just tell me I gotta. It's real time, I know. I got spoiled. I'm telling you, I got spoiled with the other way. There we go. We're going to approve with suggestions. We're just going to approve, actually. There we go. That should let us finish now. All right. So what's happening is it's basically saying that there's like this new line item and it doesn't know what to do with it. And basically to resolve this type of merge request, you have to go ahead and accept that new line. So you can manage that a bunch of different ways. But as I said, we've chosen to manage that just by manually editing the file. But I want to thank you all for attending and hearing about the joys of database deployments. As I said, they're a huge passion of mine. Just remember, choose migration-based or state-based, or there's honestly options for both. But once again, thank you for attending.
Thank you for your time and sharing with us. This has been tremendous. We
Awesome.
appreciate you
Great.
taking and contributing to the knowledge base. It's terrific. Yep. Thanks.
All right. Have a good day.
Thank you. You too. If anyone has any questions, please reach out to Elizabeth Noble.